Hello, bruvs. We're back with Books in Bed. I believe this is episode as if this were a TV program. Number 8 of Books in Bed, Crime or Curious Punishments of Bygone Days by Alice Morse Earle. Light is terrible in here right now. And this is a very uncomfortable position, but we'll start this book. Read about a half hour's worth. Curious Punishments of Bygone Days. The Drunkard's Cloak. Curious Punishments of Bygone Days by Alice Morse Earle, Chicago. Printed for Herbert S. Stone and Company at the Chapbook offices in the Caxton Building, 1896. Now reissued by Singing Tree Press, 1400 Book Tower, Detroit, Michigan, 1968. The illustrations by Frank Hazen Plug. The Bilbos. Forward. In ransacking old court records, newspapers, diaries, and letters for the historical foundation of the books which I have written on colonial history, I have found and noted much of interest that has not been used or referred to in any of those books. An accumulation of notes on old-time laws, punishments, and penalties has evoked this volume. The subject is not a pleasant one, though it often has a humorous element, but a punishment that is absolute gains an interest and dignity from antiquity, and its history becomes endurable because it has a past only and no future. That men were pilloried and women ducked by our law-abiding forebears rouses a thrill of hot indignation which dies down into a dull ember of curiosity when we reflect that they will never be pilloried or ducked again. Not for me. An old-time writer dedicated his book to all curious and ingenious gentlemen and gentlewomen who can gain from acts of the past a delight in the present days of virtue, wisdom, and the humanities. It does not detract from the good intent and complacency of those. Jesus Christ. It does not detract from the good intent and complacency of those old words that the writer lived in days when the pillory, stocks, and whipping posts stood brutally rampant in every English town. Thanks, buddy. Now we also boast that, as Pope says, taught by time our hearts have learned to glow for others' good and melt for others' woe. And I too dedicate this book to all curious and ingenious gentlemen and gentlewomen of our own days of virtue, wisdom, and the humanities. And I trust any chance reader a century hence, if such reader there be, may in turn be not too harsh in judgment on an age that had to form powerful societies and associations to prevent cruelty, not to hardened and vicious criminals, but to faithful animals and innocent children. I'm reading Crime or Curious Punishments of Bygone Days. Laying by the heels in the bilbos. What the hell do they do? Hang them up? Curious Punishments of Bygone Days. 1. The Bilbos. There is no doubt that our faraway grandfathers, whether of English, French, Dutch, Scot, or Irish blood, were much more afraid of ridicule than they were even of sinning, and far more than we are of extreme derision or mockery today. This fear and sensitiveness they showed in many ways. They were vastly touchy and resentful about being called opprobrious or bantering names, often running petulantly to the court about it and seeking redress by prosecution of the offender. And they were forever bringing such in petty slander and libel cases. Colonial courtrooms bubbled over with scandal and gossip and spite. A creature as obsolete as his name, a makebait, was ever present in the community, ever whispering slander, ever exciting contention, and often also hailed to court for punishment, while his opposite, a makepeace, was everywhere sadly needed. Far-seeing magistrates declared against the makebait as even guilty of stirring up barratry, barratry, never heard of that word, barratry, or as Judge Sewell, the old Boston Puritan, termed it, at least gravamonious. Pardon. Damn. At least gravaminous. Gravaminous? What kind of freaking word is that? Gravaminous. Gravaminous. Equally with personal libel did all good citizens and all good Christians fiercely resent of word, not only of derision or satire, but even of dispassionate disapproval of either government or church. A tithe of the plain-speaking criticism cheerfully endured in politics today would have provoked a civil war 2 centuries ago. While freedom of judgment or expression in religious matters was ever sharply silenced and punished in New England. I don't know about that because I recall reading that people used to call Thomas Jefferson, I think it was Jefferson, the N-word. And I can't exactly remember why. Maybe because he talked about emancipating slaves. Anyway, that ultra-sensitiveness which made a lampoon, a jeer, a scoff, a taunt, an unbearable and inflaming offense was of equal force when used against the men of the day in punishment for real crimes and offenses. In many, indeed, in nearly all of the penalties and punishments of past centuries, derision, scoffing, contemptuous publicity, and personal obloquy were applied to the offender or criminal by means of demeaning, degrading, and helpless exposure in grotesque, insulting, and painful engines of punishment, such as the stocks, bilboes, pillory, brank, ducking stool, or jugs. The jugs. Thus confined and exposed to the free jibes and constant mocking of the whole community, the peculiar power of the punishment was accented. Kindred in their nature and in their force were the punishments of setting on the gallows and of branding. The latter, whether in permanent form by searing the flesh or by mutilation, or temporarily by labeling with written placards or affixed initials. One of the earliest of these degrading engines of confinement for public exposure to be used in punishment in this country was the bilboes. Though this instrument to punish, I guess that's punish transgressors against ye King's Majesty's laws came from Old England, it was by tradition derived from Bilboa. It is alleged that bilboes were manufactured there and shipped on board the Spanish Armada in large numbers to shackle the English prisoners so confidently expected to be captured. This occasion may have given them their wide popularity and employment, but this happened in 1588, and in the first volume of Hakluyt's Voyages, page 295, dating some years earlier, reference is made to bilbus. They were a simple but effective restraint, a long heavy bolt or bar of iron having 2 sliding shackles, something like handcuffs, and a lock. In these shackles were thrust the legs of offenders or criminals, who were then locked in with a padlock. Sometimes a chain at one end of the bilboes attached both bilboes and prisoner to the floor or wall, but this was superfluous, as the iron bar prevented locomotion. Whether the Spanish Armada story is true or not, bilboes were certainly much used on board ship. Shakespeare says in Hamlet, "Methought I lay worse than the mutins in the bilboes." In Cook's Voyages and other sea tales, we read of bilboo bolts on sailors. Let's go back and look at this contraption. I mean, that kind of just looks like a rope. That's just a bad illustration, I guess. All right, back to the thing. The Massachusetts magistrates brought bilboes from England as a means of punishing refractory or sinning colonists, and they were soon in constant use. In the very oldest court records, which are still preserved, of the settlement of Boston, the Bay Colony, appear the frequent sentences of offenders to be placed in the bilboes. The earliest entry is in the authorized record of the court held at Boston on the 7th of August, 1632. It reads thus: Jams Woodward shall be set in the bilboes for being drunk at the New Town. Newtown was the old name of Cambridge. Soon another colonist felt the bilboes for selling pieces in powder and shot to the Indians. Pardon. Ever a bitterly abhorred and fiercely punished crime. And another, the same year, for threatening, were he punished, he would carry the case to England, was summarily and fearlessly thrust into the bilboes. Then troublesome Thomas Dexter, with his ever-ready tongue, was hauled up and tried on March 4th, 1633. Here is his sentence. Thomas Dexter shall be set in the bilboes, disfranchised, and fined £15 for specking, reproachful and seditious words against the government here established. He also suffered in the bilboes for cursing, for profane saying, "Damn ye come." Thomas Morton of Mermount, that amusing old debauchee and roisterer, was sentenced to be clapped into the bilboes. And he says the harmless savages stared at him in wonder, like poor silly lambs, as he endured his punishment, and doubtless some of the indices, gay lasses in beaver coats, who had danced with him around his merry maypole and had partaken of his cask of claret sparkling neat, sympathized with him and cheered him in his indignity. The next year, another Newtown man, being penitent, Henry Bright, was set in the bilboes for swearing. Another had slighted the magistrates in speeches. In 1635, on April 7th, Griffin Montaigne shall be set in ye bilboes for stealing boards and clapboards, and enjoyed to move his habiticon. Within a year, we find offenders being published in two places for the same offense, thus degrading them far and wide. And when in Salem they were set in the stocks, we find always in Boston that the bilboes claimed its own. Women suffered this punishment as well as men. Francis Weston's wife and others were set in the bilboes. It is high noon in Boston in the year 1638. The hot June sun beats down on the little town. The narrow paths, the wharfs, and the sweet fern and cedars on the common give forth a pungent, dry, hot scent that is wafted down to the square, where stands the governor's house, the market, the church, the homes of the gentlefolk. A crowd is gathered there around some interesting object in the middle of the square. Visitors from Newtown and Salem, Puritan women and children, tawny Indian braves in wampum and war paint, gaily dressed sailors from two great ships lying at anchor in the bay, all staring and whispering or jeering and biting the thumb. They are gathered around a Puritan soldier, garbed in trappings of military bravery, yet in but sorry plight, for it is training day in the Bay Colony, and in spite of the long prayer with which the day's review began, or perhaps before that pious opening prayer, Sergeant John Evans has drunken too freely of old sack or Alicant, and the hot sun and the sweet wine have sent him reeling. From the ranks in disgrace, there he sits, sweltering in his great coat, basted with cotton wool, and thus made defensive against Indian arrows. Weighed down with his tin armor, a heavy corselet covering his body, a stiff gorget guarding his throat, clumsy tassels protecting his thighs, and all these neatly varnished black and costing 24 shillings apiece of the town's money. Over his shoulder hangs another weight, his bandolier, a strong neat's leather belt carrying 12 boxes of solid cartridges and a well-filled bullet bag. And over all, and heavier than all, hangs from his neck, as of lead, the great letter D. Still from his wrist dangles his wooden gun rest, but his bastard musket with a snap pants lies with his pike, degraded in the dust. The sergeant does not move at the jeers of the sailors, nor turn away from the wondering stare of the savages. He cannot move, he cannot turn away, for his legs are firmly set in the strong iron bilboes, which John Winthrop sternly brought from England to the new land. Poor John Evans, your head aches from the fumes of the cloying sack, your legs ache from the bonds of the clogging bilboes, your body aches from the clamps of your trumpery armor. But you will have to sit there in distress and in obloquy till acerb old John Norton, the pious Puritan preacher, will come to chide you, as is his wont, to point out to your fellow citizens and to visitors your sinful fall, the disgracing bilboes, and the great letter that brands you as a drunkard. The decade of life of the Boston Bilboes was soon to end. It was to be laid flat, as Sir Matthew Hale would say. A rival entered the field. In 1639, Edward Palmer made for Boston with planks and woodwork a pair of stocks. Planks and woodwork were plentiful everywhere in the New World, and iron workers at first equally scarce. So stocks soon were seen in every town, and the bilboes were disused, sold perhaps for old iron, wherein they again did good service. In Virginia, the bilboes had a short term of use in the earliest years of the settlement. The provost marshal had a fee of 10 shillings for laying by the heels, and he was frequently employed, but there also stocks and pillory proved easier of construction and attainment. I would not be over severe upon the bilboes in their special use in those early colonial settlements. There had to be some means of restraint of vicious and lawless folk, of hindering public nuisances, and a prison could not be built in a day. The bilboes seemed an easy settlement of the difficulty, doing effectually with one iron bar what a prison cell does with many. It was not their use, but their glare of publicity that was offensive. They were ever placed on offenders in the marketplace, in front of the meeting house, on lecture day, on market day, not to keep prisoners in lonely captivity, but in public obloquy, and as has here been cited for what appear to us today slight offenses. The ducking stool. Curious punishments of bygone days. The ducking stool. The ducking stool seems to have been placed on the lowest and most contempt-bearing stage among English instruments of punishment. The pillory and stocks, the gibbet, and even the whipping post have seen many a noble victim, many a martyr, but I cannot think any save the most ignoble criminals ever sat in a ducking stool. In all the degrading and cruel indignities offered the many political and religious offenders in England under the varying rules of both church and state, through the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, the ducking stool played no part and secured no victims. It was an engine of punishment specially assigned to scolding women, though sometimes kindred offenders such as slanderers, makebaits, chiders, brawlers, railers, and women of light carriage also suffered through it. It would probably be helpful if they showed a front view. What are you, just sitting in the stool and you get held up in the air? That doesn't seem too bad. Through gruff old Sam Johnson said to a gentle Quaker lady, "Madam, we have different modes of restraining evil. Stocks for men, a ducking stool for women, and a pound for beasts. Yet men, as well as women scolds, were punished by being set in the ducking stool, and quarrelsome married couples were ducked, tied back to back. The last person set in the rugby ducking stool was a brutal husband who had beaten his wife. Brewers of bad beer and bakers of bad bread were deemed of sufficiently degraded ethical standing to be ducked. Unruly paupers also were thus subdued. So if you made bad beer, you could get put in the ducking stool. How the fuck would they fit the entirety of Budweiser in there and Coors Light? That intelligent French traveler Mission, who visited England about the year 1700, and who left in his story of his travels so much valuable and interesting information of the England of that day, gives this lucid description of the way pleasant enough. They fastened an armchair to the end of two beams, 12 or 15 feet long, and parallel to each other, so that these two pieces of wood with their two ends embrace the chair, which hangs between them by a sort of axle, by which means, let me get comfortable here. It plays freely and always remains in the natural horizontal position in which a chair should be, that a person may sit conveniently in it, whether you raise it or let it down. They set up a post on the bank of a pond or river, and over this post they lay, almost in equilibrio, the two pieces of wood, at one end of which the chair hangs just over the water. They place the woman in this chair and so plunge her into the water as often as the sentence directs, in order to cool her in moderate heat. All right, that's a little different. The adjectives pleasant and convenient as applied to a ducking stool would scarcely have entered the mind of anyone but a Frenchman. Still, the chair itself was sometimes rudely, I say, ornamented. The Cambridge stool was carved with devils laying hold of scolds. Others were painted with appropriate devices such as a man and woman scolding. Two Plymouth ducking stools still preserved are of wrought iron of good design. The Sandwich ducking stool bore the motto, "Of members ye tongue is worst or best, and you'll tongue off doth breed unrest." We read in Blackstone's commentaries, "A common scold may be indicted, and if convicted shall be sentenced to be placed in a certain engine of correction, called the tree bucket, castigatory, or ducking stool." The trebuchet or tray bucket was a stationary and simple form of a ducking machine consisting of a short post set at the water's edge with a long beam resting on it like a seesaw. By a simple contrivance, it could be swung round parallel to the bank, and the culprit tied in the chair, affixed to one end. Then she could be swung out over the water and seesawed up and down into the water. When this machine was not in use, it was secured to a stump or bolt in the ground by a padlock, because when left free, it proved too tempting and convenient an opportunity for tormenting village children to duck each other. A tumbrel or scold's cart was a chair set on wheels and having very long wagon shafts, with a rope attached to them about 2 feet from the end. When used, it was wheeled into a pond backward. The long shafts were suddenly tilted up, and the scold sent down in a backward plunge into the water. All right, so let's look at this again. So you place it over the water, which makes some sense here. Can we get this back? place it into the water, and then you let it go, and then they go into the water. That's fucked up. A tumbrel or scold's cart was a chair set on wheels and having very long wagon shafts. Oh, this is so uncomfortable. I do it to myself. With a rope attached to them about 2 feet from the end. When used, it was wheeled into a pond backward. The long shafts were suddenly tilted up, and the scold sent down in a backward plunge into the water. This is a pretty long chapter, actually. And we've reached our 25-minute. Actually, it should be 30 minutes, shouldn't it? See, I tried to skirt my duty. When the ducking was accomplished, the tumbrel was drawn out of the water by the ropes. Collinson says in his history of Somersetshire, written in 1791, in Shipton Mallet was anciently set up a tumbrel for the correction of unquiet women. Other names for a like engine were gumstool and coquine stool. Many and manifold are the allusions to the ducking stool in English literature. In a volume called Miscellaneous Poems, written by Benjamin West and published in 1780, is a descriptive poem entitled The Ducking Stool, which runs thus. There stands, my friend, in yonder pool, an engine called the Ducking Stool, by legal power commanded down, the joy and terror of the town. If jarring females kindle strife, give language foul or lug the coif, if noisy dames should once begin to drive the house with horrid din, the way you cry, you'll grace the stool, will teach you how your tongue to rule. The fair offender fills the seat, in sullen pomp profoundly great. Down in the deep the stool descends, but here at first we miss our ends. She mounts again and rages more than ever vixen did before. So throwing water on the fire will make it but burn up the higher. If so, my friend, pray let her take a second turn into the lake, and rather than your patience lose, thrice and again repeat the dose. No brawling wives, no furious wenches, no fire so hot but water quenches. In Scotland, flitting queens sat in ignominy in cucking stools. Bessie Spens was admonished, if she be found flyting with any neighbor, man or wife, and specially gains Jonet Arth, she shall be put on the cuck stool and sit there 24 hours. A worthless fellow sand hay for troublance made upon Andrew Watson is discerned for his demerits, to be put in the cuck stool, there to remain till 4 hours after noon. The length of time of punishment, usually 24 hours, would plainly show there was no attendant ducking, and this cuck stool or cucking stool must not be confounded with the ducking stool, which dates to the days of Edward the Confessor. The cuck stool was simply a strong chair in which an offender was fastened, thus to be hooted. Does that say hooted or booted? Thus to be hooted at or pelted at by the mob. Sometimes, when placed on a tumbrel, it was used for ducking. At the time of the colonization of America, the ducking stool was at the height of its English reign, and apparently the amiability of the lower classes was equally at ebb. The colonists brought their tempers to the new land, and they brought their ducking stools. Many minor and some great historians of this country have called the ducking stool a Puritan punishment. I've never found in the hundreds of pages of court records that I have examined a single entry of an execution of ducking in any Puritan community, while in the Cavalier counties, so-called, in Virginia and the Carolinas, and in Quaker, Pennsylvania, many duckings took place, and in law survived as long as similar punishments in England. In the statute books of Virginia from Dale's time onward, many laws may be found designed to silence idle tongues by ducking. One reads, whereas oftentimes many brabbling women often slander and scandalize their neighbors, for which their poor husbands are often brought into chargeable and vexatious suits, and cast in great damages, be it enacted that all women found guilty be sentenced to ducking. And my 30 minutes is up, so I will pause at that point. Pretty cool book. That's all, bruv. That's all.